Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Tamara Thorpe, and I am the host of our podcast for Making Connections, a handbook for effective formal mentoring programs in academia. I am here today with the authors of Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is the mentoring program as a research project. And you will see that this chapter, it has taken a village. We have an incredible group of folks here who once I read their bios, you'll know why they're all here. David Law is a human development and family studies professor at Utah State University and serves as the associate director of USU at the Utah Basin campus. He's earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from USU and his master's degree in marriage and family therapy from the University of Wisconsin-Stout, and his PhD from Brigham Young University. And he has published in the fields of marriage and family therapy, family life education, the scholarship of teaching and learning, and mentoring in academia. And for the past 5 years, he has overseen the design, implementation, and evaluation of faculty to student mentoring programs for the Utah Basin campus and the USU statewide campus system, which I'm sure as you have looked through earlier chapters and case studies, you've seen the impressive work that is happening there. And Nicole Vivalis is the Human Research Protections Executive Director at Utah State University and facilitates their IRB and oversees all of the other aspects of human research protections at USU. She's a first-generation college student and earned her BS from Florida State University and her JD from the FSU College of Law. She's passionate about higher ed programs and providing access and pathways to successful completion for underrepresented students. And in her previous role, Nicole created and oversaw mentorship programs for underrepresented and first-generation college students at Utah State. Andy Harris is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies and chair of the Southwest region for the statewide faculty to student mentoring program at USU. And Jim Lamuth is a program coordinator at Utah State University and facilitates and manages the assessment and survey data for the statewide faculty to student mentoring program, and has started actually his career in school-based mentoring programs with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and has served as an AmeriCorps volunteer in Michigan and Peace Corps volunteer in Benin, West Africa. So hello, welcome, thank you all. What an impressive group of people we have here today.
Thanks, Tamara. We appreciate you facilitating this discussion.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your contributions to the chapter. I think each of you clearly bring a unique experience and lens to this chapter that we'll get into, but there seems to be a common thread of a passion for mentoring. So what inspired the work that you do in mentoring, and what inspired your contribution to this chapter? And Dave, let's start with you.
Well, I think, Tamara, thank you. And my educational background is in, psychology, marriage and family therapy. So I've always been interested in human relationships and, what makes for good relationships, healthy, functional, supportive relationships. And so that was my early focus. And then as we had opportunities here for me personally in more of a leadership role, we really wanted to look at our students and why some students were not coming back with us the following year. And so this was the beginning of developing a faculty to student mentoring program that we offered here locally. But I just became really intrigued with just these two really simple concepts that, and this was presented in some of the research, is when a student has a positive emotional experience with a faculty member. So when they interact with them and the feeling is positive, and if they feel supported by that faculty member, they start to develop a relationship. And I just loved how simple that was, and yet how powerful it was. So that really motivated me to, kind of switch into this mentoring arena for my academic and scholarship work. So that's what motivated me. And then obviously I've had some powerful mentors in my personal life that I wouldn't be where I am without them.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Dave. Nicole, what about you?
I think I became interested and involved with mentorship as I was considering college. Didn't have adults in my family that I could lean on for that sort of experience. So I tended to go more to my peers for some of that sort of hidden information, the social capital and pieces that you don't necessarily have always as a first-gen student. And I would find that I'd go to adults for some of that information as well. And that was a harder gig for me. And there had been some time and things were different. And so my mentorship programs that I created at Utah State University were peer-to-peer actually, rather than faculty to student. And we found a lot of effectiveness there and a lot more comfort than me, this 30-something, going into these high school classrooms and talking to these young kids about why they should consider college and what we would do to keep them successful there. And then as I started in on this position at Utah State, I became more familiar with the literature on mentorship and effective mentorship and how some of those positive socio-emotional ties to the institution and those experiences really do matter for retaining those students. So as I shifted into this role now, this entire position is about centering participants over everything else that's involved in the project. And so I get to, in reviewing projects like Dave's, stay involved in that way by, again, centering those students who are being mentored and thinking very carefully about their experience and what we as an institution can do to make that as great and meaningful for them as we can.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I love that idea. And clear, I think, as folks read through the book and read through the case studies, how well Utah State really centers the learner in these experiences. So thanks for calling that out. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tamara. I mean, something that you'll find for those who go into higher education or education anyways, that we care about people, right? We want people to succeed. And that's why we've chosen to go into the field that we do. And so starting out as faculty here at Utah State, Dave reached out to me and invited me to join the faculty to student mentoring program and to help support it. And for me, that's what I want. I want my students to succeed. And this just seemed like a fantastic way to do it. As I look back on my own journey through higher ed, it was those relationships I was able to cultivate with faculty that really helped shape my experience and point me in the direction that I am now. And so if I can do that for somebody else, that's the dream.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Jim?
Yeah, for me, I was 22 years old, AmeriCorps volunteer, and got involved. And I was picked up as a program coordinator for a school-based mentoring program where we matched high school students with elementary school students, and they would mentor once a week. And I was supporting this at a number of different school districts. And it was so interesting because like programs like that you think is geared for the younger child, the elementary school child, but really who had the impact was the mentor. And then when this position became available for me, like 20 years later, I'm like, wow, I can get back into mentoring. And you become really reflective, like, okay, so who were those people in my life that made those impacts, and where did those happen in my career? And when you start to look at like the demographic shift to first generation college students, like how valuable is it to have programs like this where they can find someone on campus who is a faculty member that can help guide them through this process of navigating their college experience, because they may not have someone at home or in their peer group or in their family that can do that for them. So I think that's kind of where I came full circle.
That's fantastic. And thank you all for sharing that, because I think we can see all of you really committed to the culture of caring and supporting the learner experience. And I think, Jim, you bring up such a great point of, when we find ourselves in the role of mentoring, we can't help but think back to the mentors that we had. And as folks will read in chapter 20 on networked programs, how having multiple mentors and the capacity to build a network of mentors is such a critical skill set, both for students and once we move into the professional world. And your chapter that you all have worked on really hones in on the specificity of research. And I thought it was you made such a good point, Jim, that sometimes so often we put together a program and we expect a certain outcome, but it's not until we start collecting data that we realize that there are multiple outcomes, both positive and negative, but for the most part positive outcomes that we may not have accounted for. So Dave, can you walk us through this focus that you have in your chapter and the differences and similarities between program evaluation and program research, and why it would be important for somebody who's running a program to know the difference between the two?
Yes, and thank you, Tamara. And I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of similarities between evaluation and research, and there's also differences, and it can be a little murky navigating that arena. And so I was so grateful when Nicole graciously accepted to be a part of this book and this chapter, because I can talk from my experiences about the differences, but ultimately it's the institutional review board that guides the sponsor or whoever's developing the program through this world, because it is kind of murky. And so Nicole's work can clarify that. But I think it's important that in our modern world, in 2023, when universities institute a mentoring program, it is expected that it will be evaluated. And that's just, a few years ago, it wasn't necessarily an expectation, but today in best practices, it is expected that a program be evaluated, because you want to be able to determine, is this achieving the outcomes that we had hoped that it would? And if it's not, what do we learn from that? What modifications do we need to make? And so I think it's important to kind of clarify, okay, what I'm going to try to present this simply, and really invite Nicole to jump in here too with her expertise about these differences. But I think a couple of things that are really important is that a research project is going to have a scope beyond the actual program. And so so in evaluating a program, their outcomes, they're going to use their outcomes to see if the program is working, if it needs to be modified. But in research, you're actually trying to contribute to what's called generalizable knowledge. And so to do that, you're going to be sharing your outcomes, your processes with others, so that it impacts and contributes to the science of mentorship. And so I think that's a really critical distinction between the two of those. And so some of the things that contribute to generalizable knowledge and the science would be things like being really thoughtful about, are you testing a hypothesis? Are you implementing a new strategy that is not known in the field to be efficacious? And so, those kinds of things, the being able to think through, and I won't get real scientific here, but things like internal and external validity, so that you have confidence that what you are doing is valid, but also that it's generalizable to a larger field. And so when you're doing a research component, you're thinking through those kinds of issues early in the process, and they're impacting your design of the program. And so if you want to look at a particular treatment, you have to have something to compare that to. And so the standard in our field is a randomized control study, but in mentoring, we do know that there's enough history here that we know it's effective. And so we look at other ways so that we can still make comparisons without denying people or groups the services. But as I said, those kinds of things happen early in the process, and they're part of the overall design. And then I'm gonna ask Nicole to jump in, because she really is the residential expert in determining what is research and what is not. So Nicole, feel free to give your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll add just a couple of pieces there. So Dave touched really thoroughly on the generalizability component, which is a major component of whether a project meets the definition of human subjects research. The other is that it's systematic. And I think here is where involving your IRB and coming up with a research design up front can actually be really important, not just for your program, but for helping others learn more about what is and is not effective. So it has to be a systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And that systematic piece, I think, can really contribute something to the mentoring field. I think not unlike every other scientific field, there's a real file drawer problem for some of the science around this work that people are doing. If something is not effective, if something didn't come up with pretty sexy results on student outcomes, it goes to the file drawer of the person who funded the program or came up with the program, never to be seen or heard from again. And that's where both this systematic piece and getting the IRB review up front, I think, can really hold you accountable to a rigorous evaluation of your program that informs the field one way or the other. We see all kinds of write-ups of super successful mentoring programs and individual practices within those that turned out to be effective or really, interesting and successful student outcomes, but less so about, ooh, this thing just didn't work, and maybe we shouldn't be spending a ton of time on it. And so that's where I'll just contribute that that systematic piece, I think, can also be a real contribution to the field of rigorous evaluation of mentorship programs.
Thank you both for that distinction, because certainly I am someone who has sort of sat in that in-between space, because I'm rarely in the higher ed environment. So I can sort of get away with not having to run things through an IRB. And however, I think you make a very good case in your chapter for why folks who are in higher ed really want to consider their evaluation and consider research as a core component for all the reasons, Nicole, that you just said. Now, that being said, I would imagine, I certainly remember going through the internal review board for my graduate research. And, fortunately, my institution and my advisor made that a pretty seamless process. But I would imagine for some, it's intimidating. And it seems like, we're trying to get this program off the ground. It's an added layer. Let's not bother. So tell us why they should bother. And what advice you might give to somebody to really see you as a partner as opposed to an obstacle?
That's such a great question. Thank you so much for asking. In addition to the pieces that we mentioned earlier, sort of an upfront commitment to the rigorous evaluation of your program, I would say that it's important to remember that most IRBs in the United States and abroad are working according to 3 core principles: respect for persons, justice, and beneficence. And I would be shocked to learn that someone were starting a mentorship program at their institution of higher education that didn't deeply also care about those principles. It is an extra step. It is a little bit of layering. And certainly there are going to be times when you're pushed to come up with something that you just weren't quite ready to. Like maybe you don't have your interview protocol totally fleshed out yet because you haven't started your program quite yet. But you've got to submit something so that the IRB can make a determination. And so I'd say it's worth doing because of that shared commitment to those three core principles, and maybe in particular the justice component. And I think that IRBs can be really valuable partners in that process, because they are an outside perspective sort of looking in. You know, we're seeing the trees and the forest when we're looking at it. And so I think to that extent, it can be a useful partner in terms of that design piece. But I'd love to hear from Dave and the others about whether that has also been their experience.
Yes, and it's certainly been my experience, Nicole and Tamara, but the one thing as you were talking, Nicole, that I wanted to emphasize is when you go through that process, you get this stamp on the project. And that stamp holds a lot of credibility in the scientific world. I've been in numerous presentations where somebody has been presenting on research and somebody in the audience has asked about their IRB approval process. And when they can't solidly say that went through the review board, they're left stumbling for words, and their credibility is kind of questioned. And so I would add to what Nicole said is when you go through this process and you get this stamp from the IRB, it's expected in the scientific world because it validates that it has been thoroughly vetted by experts in this field of ethics and design and procedures that you can go to at your institution. So I would add that piece.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating because I think one of the things that you do very well in the chapter, so I hope folks go to it, is you really do articulate how well the IRB can be as a partner and helping you determine, is there a research component? If so, what is it? How can we build it out? And for those who that might be the intimidating part of the process, knowing that the IRB is, you know, a team that's going to help them with that process, I think is really helpful to know.
And I've had experiences, Tamara, with our Utah State University IRB where, you know, they'll give me feedback and they'll want me to address something. And I'm like, okay, how do I address this? But they've always been available for consultation, like, hey, call me up, shoot me an email, we'll go back and forth. You could consider this, you can consider that. And so they have this expertise that helps you see things that you probably have not had the experience to see yourself. And so it is I would say ideally it's a very collaborative experience. And I feel like we have that with under Nicole's leadership here at Utah State's IRB.
Yeah, I'll just add, we've got a broad toolbox. So we see all of the research that's done on our campus that involves human participants. And every now and again, we get something new, a new recruitment mechanism or a new sort of way of thinking about informed consent. And every time we see those, we're sort of packing those away in our toolbox for other researchers, other investigators who might benefit from those structures. So we love partnering with people rather than being just the barrier they have to overcome, because I think in a lot of ways we do have things to contribute, though of course that's not the IRB's main goal. But again, if you're working in this field, you're sharing in those principles of justice, respect for persons, and beneficence, and any opportunity we have to help a project become a better version of that project. Again, not strictly our role, but an opportunity we're grateful to have.
Yeah. That's phenomenal. And I know that I consider myself someone who embraces the concept of evaluation. And I certainly love the idea of validated research. And I know for some folks it could be intimidating. And Andy, your section focuses on measurements and measurements in for academic mentoring programs. And I think it's important because I have my reasons why I think it's important. I think for some folks it can seem like, if I'm going to do research, then I've got to do other things. But tell us a little bit about your section and why it's an important component of your chapter and for the handbook.
Yeah, so that was actually Jim,
so that's going to go to Jim.
I was gonna say, I think that's my.
Jim, there we go. Jim, your expertise.
Yeah, so with this section, what we wanted to really look at and make this kind of add to making this chapter a tool for practitioners using this is to look at well, what research has already been done, especially in relation to mentoring programs in academia. What are those constructs that already exist? What measurement tools are already there? So you don't have to go and read all of the studies and find them on your own. Not saying that this is an exhaustive list, but it's looking at does the satisfaction question and what satisfaction question has already been tested, and not just with the program, but with the mentoring relationship and the effectiveness of the program, and what benefits do mentors have, and if your program's goals were to provide psychological support, well, here's tested questions on psychological support. So we kind of break down the constructs and then looked at a few tools that were out there that are available. So if you wanted a plug and play assessment that's already been used at Johns Hopkins University, here's what it is, here's how many questions it is, here's what the measurements are. I'm just trying to, because it takes a long time to track all that stuff down. So here's kind of an overview of what those different tools are. And a number of the constructs that we've outlined in there are outlined that we're using at the program at Utah State University.
And I would just add, Jim, there's really not there's really not a repertoire of a place to go and collect assessments. There's a few websites and they're good, but specifically as it applies to academia, there's not. And so I think this is going to be one of the unique contributions of this chapter. And Tamara, I know Nora very well, and we were reviewing this chapter and getting her feedback on it, and she's like, this is so important. This is going to fill a real need in the field, and she envisions that her mentoring institute at the University of New Mexico is going to build on what Jim's work and continue to add and make this available to people so that it's easily accessible.
Well, I think sorry.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I think it goes back to the point that Nicole was making of why a university should include a research portion or include a research project with their mentoring program, is so you can add to that volume of research that's out there and those questions and constructs. And if your program's testing something a little bit different or has a goal that's a little bit different, let's make it a research project so it can become published, so we can just be adding to that repertoire that doesn't really exist, as Dave pointed out, quite yet.
Yeah, and I enjoyed that section 1 because it was very robust, but also for so many folks, there is this sense of where do I start? And knowing that tools are already available, if not to use, at least to inspire, right? The creation of something unique certainly helps take some of the intimidation factor, and as well as some of the legwork, so to speak, the work, because we know very often a program coordinator or program manager who's running a mentoring program, in some cases may have all the resources in the world, and in other cases might have fewer resources. So knowing what resources are readily available makes a huge difference.
And you don't have to create the questions yourself. They exist. Use the ones that already exist.
Yeah, I love that. All right, so now Andy. Now we come to you because David kind of said at the beginning, universities, just in general, if they're doing mentoring programs, it is a best practice that they are doing evaluation. And so when we think about this idea of there being an expectation that programs are being evaluated, and that as a program coordinator, that I'm, doing a lot of the on the ground work for the mentoring program to evaluate and to do research. Why the extra effort for building a research component into the overall plan?
It's an excellent question because it is extra effort to add the research component. Now, thankfully, we have folks like Nicole who can help us with that extra effort to get through it. And, we've tried to provide some good resources for you to accomplish that. And really, there are, I think, two main reasons to consider that. Jim alluded to it just a moment ago, that by incorporating a research component, you can add to the overall body of knowledge so that whatever you're learning from your program, others can benefit from that. Others can help to develop their own programs in a way that can be effective without having to kind of stumble through and make the mistakes that you're making as you're developing your own program. But the other important thing, and the other important reason why I would suggest going through the effort of including a research component is that when you start thinking in terms of research, it introduces a concept we talk about in the chapter called methodological rigor, right? We do things a particular way. The word that Nicole used earlier is systematic. We do things in a very particular way. And the reason we do those is because it helps us to get at the truth, right? When I teach my research methods students at the beginning of the semester, I often introduce the idea of research methods with that old story about the blind men looking at an elephant and trying to describe it to somebody else. The reason we have these rigorous methodological processes is it helps us to get at the right answer, or at least as close as we possibly can, rather than stumbling in the dark and describing something that clearly is not an elephant. And so hopefully the way we've written this chapter hopefully should give you the tools necessary to engage in a more rigorous evaluation rather than just trying to see, hey, do people like our program? But really, is our program working? Is it actually helping students to be successful?
Yeah, I love that. And in my notes, I wrote down methodological rigor because I think so often that's what comes up, particularly in evaluation within organizations outside of higher ed. When they've got data, it can very easily often be overlooked because there's a sense that there wasn't rigor and there's no IRB to validate that we're getting some, important data about what's happening within our organization. And so when we can add rigor, I think that it does help validate the work that we're doing. So one of the things I want to ask you about, because it was in chapter 13, that was written by Laura Lunsford. She talks about the difference between assessment and evaluation. I love the chapter for folks who are still navigating this assessment, evaluation, research. Chapter 13 and 14 are really complement one another. But in her work, she really articulated the importance of theory of change to evaluation and research. So can you all, or a couple of you, talk about this connection between theory of change and research?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that tomorrow. And I'm just going to add a couple of points. Excuse me, to what Andy said. When you take your project from research to research from evaluation, it's going to require you to really get into the literature and to really get a feel for where is the field at and what can we do to contribute to this field. And so that process in and of itself is going to deepen the program coordinator's understanding of the field. So I wanted to make that point. And then the second point, and Andy hit on this, you're probably doing 90% of the work already in evaluation. And just that extra 10% can really turn it to research. So it's not this huge ask in time and commitment. It's just a huge ask in being thoughtful and deliberate. And so I wanted to add that piece, that program coordinators are already doing the majority of the work needed to do research. And then Tamara, Laura in chapter 13 does this wonderful job with this theory of change, and we use that in our work here as well. But I think the main idea, and that ties a lot of things together, is programs, and we had the folks Mark and Kim and Nora that wrote chapter 2 on theoretical frameworks. It's really important that we are very deliberate in choosing our theoretical frameworks. And when we really get to know the theories, we're going to start to formalize constructs that are important to us. And when we create an operational definition of our mentoring program, we formalize what those constructs are. And as we do that, things become clear to us. And then and this is why I think is really important in the theory of change, those impact our methodology. How are we going to study these contracts? Going to Jim's work? How are we going to assess them? We were very fortunate here at Utah State University when we took our program from our individual campus at the Uinta Basin to the statewide system. Our administrators gave us an entire year to think through our theory of change. And we reference this in our chapter. It's presented in case study 16, number 3, and they present our theory of change in that case study. But it's this thoughtful process of connecting these ideas across the board. And when we do that, it's this bidirectional influence of our theory, our operational definition, our methodology, our outcomes are all tied together. They're bidirectional. Everything's impacting each other. But we spell out, this is why we think our mentoring program is going to be effective. And so when we can spell it out, it gives us confidence to get in front of university leadership, a group of experts in the field, and say, this is how we're going to do this. This is why we think this program is going to achieve the outcomes that we think it will achieve. And so that's often not done. And when you get into the literature, and people have, there's been 3 kind of meta-analysis of the mentoring field, and that's always identified as a shortcoming in our field, is making those interconnections. And so we try to take our work and then Laura's work in chapter 13 and make this case for these interconnected pieces.
Mhm.
And I'm going to ask, anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah,
That's my
if I could, Dave, I
Please.
love a theory of change when you're doing any sort of evaluation, because I think it's really easy when we're, if we're in a situation where we're thinking, okay, how can we help our students? Well, a mentoring program, that's what we can do to help our students. But the question then should come, well, why? What exactly does a mentoring program do to help our students? And so you have to just take that thought and say, well, establishing a good relationship with a mentor is going to mean students are more likely to come back. Well, why does that happen? Well, that builds feelings of connection to the university. Okay. And the nice thing about developing that theory of chain, that logical if-then statements of these are the process that is going to happen to our students, then all of a sudden we know what we need to measure, right? Dave was talking about this. If we believe that having a good relationship with a mentor is going to establish connectedness to the institution, then, okay, we need to measure connectedness to the institution. That's our variable that we need to measure and see if that changes as a result of being a part of the mentoring program. The theory of change one, it helps you to develop the program itself, but then it comes with it, and here's what you need to measure. This is the research and the evaluation component. It does it all for you in such a wonderful way.
I love that. Sorry, Nicole, I was just gonna
No.
say, I love that because as I was reading both 13 and 14, and actually since every time I read the whole book, I think, oh man, I got to go back and do things differently, which is so brilliant because it really is about adding skills and tools to the work that we're doing to only make it better. And I know that this idea, the theory of change with the theoretical framework to really guide and inform how you do your assessment and evaluation and research. For somebody who does a lot of evaluation and research, it was really profound and I really appreciated. So Nicole, what do you want to add to this conversation?
Oh, I was just going to say, and from, the IRB perspective, one of the things, again, that we're looking at is that systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. The causality piece that just so much flows from the theory of change framework that others have already touched on, the bidirectionality and the logical steps and logical connectedness. I think the point at which you are approaching your mentorship program from a theory of change standpoint, you are starting to think about it as a structured research program. And so why not share that knowledge with the rest of the mentoring world?
Yeah, and I think, Dave, you made such a good point. You're already doing most of the work, right? So it really is just adding to that. So as we close our conversation, I want to get your insights because we're kind of imagine if we are talking to somebody who is at that decision making. Do I take my evaluation and do I approach IRB? Do I move from evaluation to research? If I'm going to do that, what is a must-have? What is a must-have if I'm going to move my mentoring program evaluation to research?
I would say a must-have is to start developing a relationship with personnel from the Institutional Review Board, and let them be a part of that process from the beginning, because they have expertise that you likely don't have. That would be my 2 bits, but I'm curious what Andy, Nicole, and Jim would add to that.
We talk a little bit about the sort of logistical must-haves in the chapter. So there's a little bulleted list of, know the purpose of your project and who your participants are. But the thing I would say must-have is what also Dave just said, an openness to accepting the IRB as a partner in this endeavor, because again, we're all here for the very same reasons. And I think IRBs can be scary and they can be daunting and they can be uncertain, and some of them can take a while, but in the end, the goals are the same. And what project isn't made better from a diversity of viewpoints feeding into the outcomes there?
That's great. So what would be a nice to have? Sometimes, right, it could feel overwhelming to think of all the things I have to have, but what might be a nice to have? Maybe I can't have everything, but if I could have this, it would be nice.
Jim and Andy, I'm going to defer to you on that one.
Well, I was going to go back to the must-haves and be like, I think
Okay.
really with implementing a program with that research component, having that administrative support a couple levels up, because it's not just your IRB that you need to get this through, but you're working with, like at Utah State University, we're working with the assessment accreditation office to get data and to back up the research that we're doing later down the road. And I think it's helpful that we have administrative support. We have the IRB support for us to be able to work with the AAA office to get that information.
And I would just concur, thanks for sharing that, Jim, because boy, once you need assistance from a lot of people when it comes to getting data.
Yeah.
And I think that is a must-have.
As far as a thing that's nice to have, someone like Jim who manages our data and handles the surveys, that is an amazing thing to have in running an evaluation research project like this. just having somebody who that's their job is managing all that data, because it is a lot to manage.
Yeah, I know as I was reading the chapter, I certainly thought the same thing. I thought, how nice it is to have somebody who is responsible for that data really designated, because that can be daunting. There are folks like me who like to go deep into data. You know, people say qualitative data too much, and I'm like, the more the better. I love digging into that, but that's not everybody's jam. So, you know, Jim and I, we like being immersed in the data, but it is a nice to have, not something everybody might have, but to get folks thinking as they venture on this, who is your data person, and you know, what's their favorite candy, and you know, start building that relationship.
I would say another
Uh,
nice to have is the kindness that Jim has done everyone in this chapter. There's so little wheel left to recreate after this, you know, using those measures. And then, you know, I bet Dave would be so very willing to share his protocol with anybody else who's thinking about approaching their IRB. I guess I just put you on the spot for that, Dave.
Happy to.
But, you know, there are all of these resources. And so those are two that I can think of that would be very nice to have.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think lots of the chapters provide some really great blueprints, some frameworks, and some resources that I think all the readers are going to leave with an abundance of resources to choose from. So what might be things that are on folks' mind that as they go in this process from evaluation to research, we can live without? They don't have to worry about it. We can live without that.
I would say it's kind of related to your question, Tamara, but don't feel like you have to have everything resolved before you get started. It's okay. In fact, I would encourage people, start small. You know, hopefully you can kind of have that theory of change laid out. But if you're missing an assessment for a particular construct, and you realize it's going to hold the entire project up for 6 months because you're going to have to develop it yourself, you know, don't sweat that. Just get started with it. Think small, and just view it as this ongoing work in progress.
I think it goes back to like, what are the values and goals of your program? Why are you having the mentoring program, and scale it back to that? Because you could look at all these different constructs that are available and keep adding them on and adding them on. But maybe that's not what your mentoring program needs to be.
Fantastic. Well, I again, I want to thank you all for your contributions to the book, to this chapter, and of course, the incredible contributions you are making on your campus, and as a result, your community. I have been incredibly impressed with what is happening on the Utah campus state. And happening, you know, statewide. It is impressive, and I think certainly the scholarship research that's been done is contributing to that generalized knowledge. I know I'm taking it with me in the work that I do in private industry. So thank you so much for those contributions, and thank you so much for this conversation today. I have enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you, Tamara.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening and watching today. And we look forward to seeing you in our next podcast episode. Bye-bye.